Hi, everybody, and welcome to Gendered Families. This is the first in a series of lectures where we're focusing on specific gendered institutions within, mainly focused on Canadian society here, like the family, like education, like the workplace. And we'll be talking about some of the ways that gender manifests itself in each of those institutions. And you'll also be getting some insights into the way these institutions um, mutually reinforce each other or kind of work at cross purposes or in contradiction to each other, as well as some of the diversity and inherent contradiction within these institutions. So here we go. Before we even get to the substance of this lecture, there are two sort of key concepts that will help you make sense of the material here. And there's a lot of material. And one is the idea of the concepts are actually quite similar. One's the idea of a half changed world. And this comes from a lot of observations and study by sociologists and others who've observed that over the last few decades, let's say maybe 3 or 4 decades, expectations and ideals related to gender, that is, what people say they aspire to or what they want or what they value, those have changed, but actual practices and actions and patterns of behavior lag behind. So we have this transformation in the area of ideas about gender and what's good and what people want to, how they see themselves living their lives in a gendered world. And then we see something very different when we look at what is actually sort of on the ground happening. Who's in what job, who's still doing the bulk of the unpaid work, who's making more money, and so forth. So there's contradiction and discrepancy in the pace of social change going on. And similar is the concept of a stalled revolution, which is the idea that in terms of gender, you've had major changes in some institutions or some areas of social life, but much smaller or slower changes in other institutions or other areas of social life. So, for instance, you may have had uh, great changes in schools. Certainly, if you take post-secondary education and you look back 20, 30 years in terms of gender, looks totally different than it does now. But then other institutions, other areas of social life and social organization, the gender revolution, the sort of revolution towards greater equity has kind of stalled. Certain sectors of the workforce, for instance, if you took them, might not look a whole lot different now than they did 20 or 30 years ago. So across Canada as a whole, if you think of Canada as made up of all these different social institutions and places where people interact and where social action is going on, you're going to see kind of a patchwork. Some have been and continue to be very much transformed by the changes in the way people think about and act gender, and others not really so much. There's others where the gender revolution that feminism brought about is still not got a whole lot of traction. So if you keep these ideas in mind, half-changed world, stalled revolution, I think that they will help you kind of see some of what we're talking about in the next few weeks in a broader context. So with the family, here's where we're going to go. I'm going to talk briefly, way too briefly, about some of the historic contexts of Canadian families. I'm going to spend a bit of time on something called the SNAF. And I know if you've taken sociology of family courses, you may already know what the SNAF is. If not, you're going to find out. I'm taking some time on that because the SNAF sort of acts as a reference point or an idea of what a family ought to be that we're still kind of grappling with today, even though we know, the majority of Canadian families are not SNAFs and haven't been SNFs for a long time, but it's historically important, so we're going to look at that. And then I want to look at gender and marriage, heterosexual marriage. I'm focusing on heterosexual marriage because it's a data thing. Most of the nationally representative data that we have thus far, especially if you want to look at how things change over time, is from heterosexual couples who marry. So it's not as though heterosexual people are the only ones who get married, but it is the case that most of the information we have about gendered divisions of labor and so forth within marriages pertain to heterosexual marriages. I want to talk about gendered parents, how parenting may be gendered, and maybe as a consequence, the gendered children who emerge as a result. And some of this may tie into things we talked about earlier when we talked a bit about cognitive development and social learning theory. It's got a lot to do with childhood. So here we go. Historic contexts of Canadian families. If we go back and we look at before the arrival of settlers and colonists from Europe, at the way people were living their gendered lives within Indigenous families. I mean, Canada's a big place. It's really hard to overgeneralize, or rather, it's easy to overgeneralize. It's hard to generalize accurately about all Indigenous societies and communities because there was a lot of variation between them. But in contrast to white settler norms of marriage and family, which I'm going to get to, we can make some sort of general statements about different ways in which Indigenous families enacted or lived out gender. Indigenous communities tended to have a fairly complex array of family forms. You had the nuclear family, parents and their child as a unit living together, working together, and so forth. You had extended family, so the grandparents, the cousins, aunts and uncles, and so forth, who also cooperated or collaborated, and of course, sometimes got into arguments with each other and so forth. You had, in many communities, you had the idea of a clan, which was greater than an extended family, but not as all-encompassing as a whole society in itself. So clans were a bit like lineages in that way. And clans often served to kind of mark out who could marry who. Marrying within your own clan was considered not appropriate. Who had obligations to who. If you and somebody else, if you shared a clan affiliation, then you might have some responsibilities towards each other, and serve to organize social life kind of beyond the immediate family and the extended family. And many Indigenous societies also operated with an idea of family, or more broadly, kin or kinship, that went beyond even like people, human beings, to include a sort of kin or familial relationship to elements of the natural world, to plants, to trees, animals, bodies of water, rocks, forests, and so forth. So the notion of family didn't just sort of stop, with either people that gave birth to you or people that you could trace a clear relationship to, or even with people at all. The concept of family could be expanded to include many forms of kin relations with many types of entities, not all of which were human. In terms of how families functioned, again, at the risk of huge overgeneralizing, we can say a few general statements. Indigenous families typically functioned in terms of gender with what we think of as gender complementarity, which is the idea that the different genders As you know, not all Indigenous societies recognized only two genders, some recognized more than that. But each gender has their area of responsibility and their area of expertise and their area of authority. And it's the combination of these different gendered individuals with their gendered areas of expertise and authority that come together to make survival possible and to make thriving possible. At the same time, as gender complementarity, the evidence we have suggests that compared to the settlers that showed up and kind of took over, Indigenous families tended to have a relatively high degree of gender equality, in that women and men and people of other genders exercised close to equal decision-making power. The notion of legal subordination, that women were legally sort of the property of their husband or the property of their father, was not present. And that the idea of that the man is the head of the household and in charge of everything and nobody can tell him what to do was also not a very common idea. So there was a higher degree of gender equality than the people who came after them. There was also, interestingly, a fair bit of fluidity when it came to marriage, possibly because marriage in many of these communities was not as bound up with the state and the institution of private property. So Indigenous people had in general, easier time than Europeans did getting into marriages and then exiting marriages if they weren't working or if the marriage had broken down in some way. And the ending of a marriage typically could be initiated by either partner, by making the decision to just leave. So marriages could be fluid in terms of entry and exit. They were also often polygamous, multiple wives for one man. And the entry and exit into polygamy was also fairly easy because it too was not as bound up with the notion of private property in the state. And these three things taken together, a higher degree of gender equality, marriage fluidity when it comes to entry and exit, and polygamy being relatively common, essentially kind of freaked out the settlers who arrived and decided that they needed to impose their ideas of what marriage and family looked like based on a fairly rigid gender hierarchy. So what happened? Sorry, here we are. What happened was really not good. We saw at the level of laws, as Europeans consolidated power within Canada, a rejection of family forms, in particular among First Nations communities. The white people who arrived typically understood polygamy as morally wrong. There was a view that polygamy often involved very young women or girls, young teenagers, and the evidence suggests that that's probably was not the case, that the marriage of very, very young girls was an anomaly. When it happened, it was not the way things usually went, but that was used as an excuse or as a reason to try to suppress polygamy, this idea that it was harmful to children. The ease of entry into and exit from marriages also kind of freaked out settler authorities who were used to marriage being, two people together for life, impossible or nearly impossible to dissolve. And they saw it as a form of promiscuity, that people are just kind of going from one partner to another promiscuously. instead of getting married properly the way they should. They did not recognize it as, here's a different approach to marriage that offers or that has lower barriers to entry and to exit. And they were also perturbed by what they saw as the unnatural or improper dominance of women within marriages, the way women could make decisions in the absence, if the man wasn't around, the woman could make decisions for the family. If the man was around, decisions got made together. Women had control over their own labor power. They had control over many of the assets of the family. And this conflicted with European models of how marriage should work, which were very definitely patriarchal, where it was very definitely the man in charge and the woman fulfilling her role and her function, but subordinate to him. So laws were passed, attempts to get people to change their ways were initiated, all of which amounted to attempts to radically overhaul and to indeed destroy the marriage and family forms that had pre-existed the arrival of settlers. Nothing, these family forms were durable in the sense that they were not entirely destroyed, and they're still meaningful and important today. But certainly the influence of white colonists on Indigenous families was not in a positive direction. Over the last little over 150 years, overlapping with the arrival of white settlers into most of what is now Canada, many, many things happened that we don't have time to talk about, but I want to focus on one trend that really had big implications for gender and families, and that was the transformation of Canada from, I should say, a primarily rural population to an urban-dominated population in the course of the 19th and early to mid-20th century. So the graph you've got there shows you Canada's rural population, people living outside cities, as a percentage of their total population. And you'll see it goes from the 1850s, where the vast majority of Canadians lived in rural areas. They lived outside of cities, and it just falls steadily all the way down until now we have less than 1 in 5 Canadians lives in a rural setup, lives by farming or by producing food and sustenance on a farm or on a rural situation. And this shift from rural to urban had some major implications in terms of families. Again, it's really easy to overgeneralize here, so I'm just going through some significant trends. Families living in rural areas, especially families that were farming families or that were living off the land in some way, typically had a fairly high degree of work-home integration. Your workplace, the farm, is also where you live. There's not a geographic divide separating, okay, this is home, and okay, over here, this is work. Like if you were going out to work in a factory or an office or a school or something. Rural families also tended to be production and consumption units, by which I mean that they not only consumed food, fuel, clothing, games, toys, furniture, what have you, but that they also produced it amongst their members. So, we'll get to the contrast with urban families later, but this idea that rural families were both producing and consuming the things that they needed is significant. And what these two things required, the family home integration being both a production and consumption unit, was that amongst genders and generations, men and women, old and young, had to work together in close proximity, getting tasks done, getting things completed together in order for the family overall to survive. We have this idea or this belief that, back in the 19th century, early 20th century, men were men and women were women, and they never overlapped or crossed. But historical evidence actually suggests that in rural or family farm, or living off the land scenarios, there was much more gender flexibility around the tasks of production than cliches would lead us to think, or kind of projecting backwards from the 20th century would lead us to think. So you'd have, men knitting and sewing as well as women, women out hunting if the family needed meat for food, or plowing the land, or what have you. Tasks and work, although it wasn't like everybody did everything, and gender and age didn't matter. Tasks and work were much more transferable across gender and generational divides than they became later on. So that later on is when we get to urban families. And what we have here are some significant differences. The first is the separation between home and the workplace. People went out to work. You left your home and you went to the factory, or you went, wherever it was, and closed the door on your home and you left. And what this led to was the gradual invisibilization of work that went on in the home, especially unpaid work. And we'll see what some of the consequences are a bit later on in this lecture. So work at home almost became invisible, partly because it was removed from the cash nexus, from the exchange of money for the work that people got paid for when they went out. Families shifted gradually to becoming primarily consumption units. So urban families, much less likely to make their own clothes, raise their own food, build their own furniture, create their own entertainment. The household as a unit would consume, but the things that they consumed much more likely to be purchased through market relations, bought in a store, or ordered from Amazon, or what have you. So the production unit function of the family sort of withered away. And we also saw among urban families much greater a tendency towards much greater separation and distinction between genders and generations in terms of the types of work or the types of activity that were considered appropriate or normative to be undertaken by members of different genders. And that's something that we're going to be talking a lot about in the parts which follow. The ideological or philosophical analog to these changes in the way families were organized and the way they functioned was the notion of, we can call it an ideology of separate spheres. And this is a very gendered ideology. It's the idea, as you see in the illustration here, that women belong in the domestic sphere. Women are specialized in nurturing and caring, and not incidentally cooking and cleaning and child-rearing and so forth. That is their natural place. And to men falls the outside world of the public, of the workplace and politics and organized religion, and you name it. If it happens outside the household, particularly if it doesn't involve children, then it is the proper sphere of men. So this notion that there are these sort of natural areas of interest or natural areas of activity for women and for men has proven to be surprisingly long-lived and durable. And that's what we're going to come up to next.